Good evening, everyone. It's time to start our webinar, and welcome everyone to our Luxoft LTS webinars. In a few minutes, in a few seconds, in fact, we will start our lecture. And meanwhile, I would like to go through some minor organizational part. First thing is that our webinar will last for 1 hour, and then we will have a Q&A session. And next part is that during our webinar you can have an opportunity to ask questions or interact with our speaker, Scott Helme, and you can see in the bottom right corner the Q&A part where you can write down your questions, and our speaker, Scott, will read them loud and answer them. And well, good luck. And Scott, it's your time.
Hello there. Thank you very much for the introduction. As Martha said, my name is Scott Helme, and you can see up on the slide in front of you that I have intentionally left out my job title. And one of the things that I do as part of my role is that I am a security researcher. And this means that I spend quite a lot of my time, both professionally and personally, looking for security vulnerabilities in various different products. That could be websites, mobile applications, actual physical hardware devices, and sometimes even cars, if you've followed my research. And I spend a lot of my time, therefore, doing what a hacker does. I'm looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities in systems, and we do that in order to understand what the problems are, in order to make the system stronger, to make them safer as a result of my research and other researchers like me. So I spend a lot of my time doing what a hacker does, trying to break systems. Now, I don't go by the term hacker, I use the term security researcher instead. This is largely because the term hacker has become a bit of a media word recently. It's in the press a lot. It has, a lot of buzzword and hype around it. Another reason is that hacker is typically quite a negative term. So if I say to people that I'm a hacker, they typically hide their phone or turn off Wi-Fi or some other kind of negative reaction. But the third reason is that according to Google image search, I don't look anything like a hacker anyway. So if you go to Google image search wherever you are and type in the word hacker, you won't see a picture of anything that even closely resembles me. So there's quite a few reasons I don't do that. These are the main ones, but I've been quite fortunate to have a lot of national and international coverage of some of the work that I've done. Just a month or two ago last year, I found there's an energy supplier in the UK, and I could reset the password for any of their accounts and log into them. They fix this. This is the purpose of my research. I find these vulnerabilities, I tell them, they fix it, and we're better afterwards. But they do usually get some press. Here, I'm sure many developers have done this before, copied code off Stack Overflow. But when you get caught doing this and you're Nissan, and it's the application that controls your vehicles, that gets the attention of the press, and it gets you some headlines as well. And this was the actual kind of one of the big pieces of research that I was involved in with car hacking. A researcher from Australia called Troy Hunt invited me to participate, and we found a way to remotely control certain features of the Nissan Leaf vehicle. And as well, here in the UK, there's an ISP called EE, and they have over 1 million customers, I believe now, and their routers were insecure. I could watch your internet traffic. I could see what you were doing on the internet through your router remotely from wherever I was located. And the final one, just recently, I've just been on the BBC again for a secure email company. They claim to have the most secure emails in the world, and it turns out that they didn't. So, I spend my time, a lot of it, looking at kind of almost the negative sides of security. I look for problems, I look for weaknesses. But one thing that I want to talk about today is something on the slightly more positive and proactive front. And every site across the internet right now, anybody that hosts an online service somewhere, are either already getting or will soon be getting one of these, and we all refer to them by different names. We call them different things. This could be most commonly a HTTPS certificate, or a TLS certificate, or an SSL certificate. And we call them different names. It's always the same thing underneath. It's the same document, this server certificate. And we need to get these certificates if we want to deploy HTTPS onto our websites. This is why we need them, because these are the documents that allow us to get the green padlock in the address bar of the browser, to get HTTPS and to have secure communications on the internet. And I do some research. I actually have a set of crawlers, and every day I scan and analyze the top 1 million websites on the planet. And every 6 months I produce a report, and I look at various different aspects of the security of these top 1 million sites. So here we can see these reports are published every 6 months on my site. Here we can see the top 1 million sites. So on the left-hand side, they're grouped into groups of 4,000. So on the left-hand side, we have the top 4,000 sites, and you can see how many in there deploy HTTPS. Over on the right side of the graph is the last 4,000 websites in the top 1 million. And we can see as we move down the ranking, you're less likely to deploy HTTPS. The more popular your site is, the more likely you are to deploy it. But the biggest trend on this graph is that every 6 months when I publish this report, the total number of sites that deploys HTTPS is moving upwards. We are deploying HTTPS more and more. And this kind of makes sense. Everybody's moving towards an encrypted web. There's many other benefits apart from security to deploy HTTPS. But if I represent this data slightly differently, this is the percentage of those sites that deploy HTTPS. So we can see that in late 2015, we were at about the 6 or 7% mark of websites. So this is the 6 or 7% of the top 1 million sites. February this year, which is the latest data published so far, and we'd hit 20% of sites in the top 1 million deploying HTTPS. But the interesting thing on this graph is that not only are we continuing to deploy it, not only are we deploying HTTPS across more and more sites, the rate at which we're doing it is actually increasing. This graph gets steeper as we move towards the right-hand side. So we're actually accelerating our deployment as well. And right now, actually, we're deploying HTTPS, we're deploying encryption on the web faster than at any point in history previous to now. So this is the best that we've ever done, and it's continuing to get better. One of the big reasons for this, or certainly one of the largest contributing factors, is an organization called Let's Encrypt. And these guys give out free certificates. So the certificates that I talked about just a few slides ago, you typically had to pay for them. Historically, they used to cost money, sometimes only in the region of maybe $10 or $20, sometimes more. But the cost was certainly one of the barriers to entry, especially if you need many of these certificates. Let's Encrypt now give them away free, and they actually launched in January 2016. So the red line here shows their presence in the top 1 million sites in February 2016. So right after they launched, as you would expect, they had a very low presence in those sites. But just a year later, we can see they've had this massive growth as more sites start to adopt HTTPS. They're using the free certificates offered by Let's Encrypt, and we're increasing that rate of deployment. Now we need these certificates. We talk about certificates, and certificates give us something called authentication. And that means that you get a certificate to prove that you are who you say you are. So if you are PayPal.com, you get a certificate to prove that you are definitely PayPal.com. And that allows the browser to authenticate who you are, authenticate your identity. Because secure communication on the internet is not possible without authentication. And what this means is that if we can't be sure we're talking to the correct website, then we can't ever communicate securely. This is what the certificate allows us to do. It allows us to prove that we are who we say we are. And this is quite easy to demonstrate. We imagine a visitor, they open their browser and they go to PayPal. And if we were using HTTP, if we had no HTTPS here, it would be really easy for an attacker to either observe that connection and observe what you were doing, or simply pretend to be PayPal, because we would have no way to know whether or not we were talking to the genuine PayPal.com website. But as soon as we get a certificate and we introduce HTTPS into this equation, we can now challenge the person at the other end to prove their identity. And this is what the certificate does. We can challenge them and they can prove to us that they are definitely PayPal.com. And this stops the attack. This allows us to have secure communications. So we're absolutely dependent on these documents. And Many of you may have seen the next slide before, actually. The problem that we're trying to solve here is that on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog, right? Like we're on the other end of a connection, and we can't see or verify the identity of that person there. And this is what certificates solve, is that you could be anybody or anything that you claim to be. Certificates allow us to resolve this issue. They allow us to have authentication and to have proof of identity. So we all need certificates. Certificates are a good thing, and they do give us something that we desperately need. The process of obtaining a certificate is really simple. So we have our website, and we want to set up HTTPS. We need to get our certificate. So we generate something called a CSR, and this is a certificate signing request. And we generate this request, and we send it to a certificate authority like Let's Encrypt that I just talked about. They will see this request. They will challenge us to prove our identity to them in some way. Sometimes they will email you a challenge code, or they will ask you to set a DNS record to prove that. And if you can prove your identity and satisfy them, they issue a certificate, they sign it, and they give it back to you and say, here is your certificate, here is your document, your proof of identity. And that's all there is involved in obtaining a certificate. We then install that on our server and send it to the browser as usual. So the browser comes along, I say I am scotthelme.co.uk, I provide my certificate, and the browser will add the padlock and turn the address bar green to say, we have validated that you are definitely speaking to the correct website. You are definitely speaking to the website you think you're speaking to. And the certificate itself, there's nothing particularly fancy that goes on with the certificate. There's nothing special. It's just a text file, essentially, with some metadata inside it. And it includes things like what we call the common name. So this is the name that the certificate has been issued to, in this case, my domain. They also have information about the issuer. So when the browser receives this, it can say, okay, who issued this document? Do I trust the authority that issued the document? So we can see here it's Let's Encrypt was the issuer. And they have a couple of other things as well, like the valid to and from date. So this is the validity period for the certificate. So essentially it's just a text document with these various pieces of information inside it. And if you inspect a certificate and look at one, it really is just a text file. There's not much more to them. So we have certificates issued, we have them deployed, and the certificate is a public document. So somebody comes to my website, the browser comes along, and I give them a copy of my certificate, and I say, here is my certificate. Now, it would be a problem if you could just take a copy of that certificate and present it to somebody else, and you take it and use it. So there is one other thing required to use it, and it's the private key, something we call the private key. So there's actually a key on my server, and this is what allows me to use the certificate. You can only use the certificate if you have this key in your possession. So I can send the certificate out to anybody that comes along, and I don't need to worry about them taking a copy and trying to use it, because I never send out a copy of my key. It's my private key. And this is the thing that is required. This is literally the key to the kingdom. You need this. But unfortunately, we don't have perfect security. Sometimes problems happen. Sometimes our websites, our web servers are compromised. And we've seen this in the past happen at a large scale when somehow somebody manages to steal a copy of your key. They may intrude into your servers. They may physically steal it. It doesn't matter how, but these things do happen. We have bad days in security. So what this now means is that if someone steals your key, that's what they need to be able to use your certificate. So we now have this third party that can essentially prove that they are us. So they can take this certificate, they can present it to the browser, and they can say, I am scotthelme.co.uk, and here is my certificate. I can prove to you that I am this website. And the problem is that they are not us. They are not our website. So we now have this person, this entity online that can prove they are us when they are not us. And that's a really bad situation to be in, because we have somebody that can successfully impersonate us and get the green padlock and the green HTTPS in the address bar. So we need some way of revoking this certificate. This is what we call it. We need to take back the trust. We need to say, I've lost my key, something happened. This particular certificate has been stolen, and you are no longer allowed to trust it. We've been compromised. Don't accept it. No matter who gives you this document, do not accept it because it's compromised. So we need revocation. We need a way to take back the trust in this certificate, because if we lose one and somebody can get our key to use it, we're in a really bad situation. We can't have people on the internet that can prove they are us when they are not us. So when this happens, when this key compromise scenario comes along, we call it, we have to go back to our website, and this time we generate something called a revocation request, and we send that to the certificate authority, and we say, look, we were hacked, or somebody left their bus on the train, their laptop on the bus or the train. Something bad happened, so we need to revoke this certificate. We send that request to the CA, and they will then mark our certificate as revoked, and they have two different mechanisms to do this. So they store an entry in what we call the CRL, and the CRL is just a certificate revocation list. So this is quite literally just a big list of all of the certificates that have been revoked, and you can go download one of these lists and look at it, and it is literally just a big list that says all of these certificates are revoked. You are not to trust them. But there's a couple of problems with that, and as you can imagine, these lists can grow to be quite large, which is one of kind of the main problems, because it is just a big list. The other option that they have that we see used more frequently nowadays is something called OCSP. And this is the Online Certificate Status Protocol. And what this allows you to do is you can ask for the revocation status of a single certificate. So you can say, I've got this particular certificate. Here is its serial number, because all certificates have a serial number. So you say, here is a serial number for a certificate. Is this particular certificate revoked? Yes or no? And the responder will come back to you and say, no, it's not revoked, it's fine, or yes, it is revoked, do not use it. So these are the two mechanisms that the certificate authority has that we can rely on to revoke our certificates. So in a compromised scenario, we have this attacker who's stolen our key, and they're using our certificate to impersonate us. They're pretending to be us when they are not, and the browser needs to know that this certificate is revoked. So what used to happen was the CA has their CRL server, as we just talked about. The browser will reach out to the CRL server, and it will just download a copy of the list. And it will download this list, and it will look through it and see if the certificate that it just got is on the revocation list. So if we get a certificate, we go download the revocation list. If we find that certificate on the revocation list, then we know the certificate is revoked, and we must not trust it. The browser will throw that certificate away and say, nope, I will not use this. I'm going to close the connection because this certificate is revoked. It is not safe. So this serves the purpose. We can now mark this certificate as revoked, and if somebody tries to use it, then the browser will download the CRL and see that there is a problem. The other mechanism that we have, I just talked about, was OCSP. And it works in exactly the same fashion in terms of what the browser does. So we have the browser, it receives this certificate, it sends a request to the OCSP responder, as we call it, and we get back an OCSP response. And the only difference with the OCSP response is that it's just the response for this particular certificate. It's basically a yes/no answer. So the browser says, is this certificate revoked? And the CA's OCSP responder basically says yes or no. That's pretty much all we're looking for. Is it good or is it bad? And again, if it comes back and says this certificate is revoked, the browser will take away the indicators. It will close the connection. It will not use this certificate. So in practice, the exercise of revocation checking, it sounds fairly simple, and the mechanisms themselves are actually quite simple. We download the CRL, or we ask the OCSP responder, and we get our response either way, and then we know whether or not the certificate we've got is good or bad. But there are a couple of kind of issues with this approach. And the first of these is that when we go to a website and we get the certificate, we don't know if we're talking to the genuine website or to an attacker, and we don't actually know anything about the certificate we just got. So the browser has to do this revocation check every time, because we don't know if we're under attack, and we don't know if the certificate has been revoked. So we have to check every time, because if we don't check, then maybe it was revoked, maybe it is revoked. So there's constant kind of dependency on the browser to always perform these revocation checks, as we call them. So it has to reach out to one of these two servers and try and get an answer, try and download the CRL or try for the OCSP. But what happens if the servers look like this? What happens if your CA is having a bad day? What happens if your CA is down? Something's happened. Maybe they're being DDoS'd. Maybe somebody turned off the data in their power center by accident. It doesn't matter. But if these servers are offline, what does the browser do now? And historically, the browser used to take what we call a hard fail approach. So the browser would reach out to these servers and try to do the check. But if the servers weren't there or it couldn't get a response for whatever reason, then obviously this check would fail and the browser would say, well, look, I'm sorry, but I can't check the status of this certificate, so I'm going to refuse to accept it. This was called hard fail revocation checking. If we can't do the revocation check, we must refuse the certificate. But this brought with it the problem that if your certificate authority is offline, if these servers are down, your website is down as well, because the browser can't check the status, which means it can't accept the certificate, which means you're offline. So the certificate authority could essentially take your website offline if they have a bad day. And that comes with it a whole host of problems. Do you want this third party that has the ability to take your website down effectively at the push of a button? And this wasn't the only problem with revocation. So if you look at the certificate revocation list, this is a list of all revoked certificates. How big, just think to yourself now, how big do you think that file is? And remember that when the browser connects to your website, it also has to go and download this file before it can connect to your website, because it has to check the revocation status of the certificate first. So this file that it's downloading is blocking your website from loading. It has to download this file first. Some people guess, bytes, maybe kilobytes even. But even if this was only a 50 kilobyte file, the browser has to go off and download this 50 kilobyte file before it can open your website. And that's, potentially a lot of data if you're on a slow connection. But what if it was a 500 kilobyte file? What if the CRL was quite large? The browser now has to download half a meg file before it can even open your website. And if the user's on a slow connection, that will make a noticeable impact on how slow your website appears to be, because the user doesn't know this is happening. But CRLs, they grew too large a long time ago, actually, and it wasn't uncommon to see CRLs that were a meg, 10 meg, 50 meg, or one of Apple's CRLs actually hit 90 meg earlier this year. And this is largely what led to CRLs being abandoned. We actually do have revocation lists out there that are 90 meg in size, and no one in their right mind is going to download these files anymore because they just don't scale. Creating a big list of all revoked certificates was not a good solution. That's why most of the web nowadays relies on OCSP. We really don't see much use of the revocation list, especially not on the client in the browser. But there is one problem with OCSP. So OCSP is just the status request. We say, is this revoked, yes or no? And we get a yes or no answer back. So that answer is really small, which is really good from a performance standpoint, because we now don't have to download this big file. We just download a very small yes/no answer. But there is one problem with OCSP, and it was a problem that many people don't see, and it's privacy. Because when we reach out to the OCSP responder, we're saying, is this certificate for this particular website revoked, yes or no? And that question essentially looks like this. So you're now asking the certificate authority, this third-party entity that you as a user, as the operator of the browser, don't have any real link to. You're going to them and saying, is the certificate for the website I'm about to visit, is that still valid? So essentially what you do is you leak your entire browsing history to the certificate authority, and you do that in real time as you're browsing. So as soon as you type the domain name into the browser and hit enter, the browser will go and do the OCSP check to see if the certificate is valid. So you literally leak your browsing habits and data in real time. So both CRL and OCSP weren't perfect. CRL stopped being used a long time ago. OCSP is kind of where we are today, but it does have its issues. And the hard fail one that I talked about on the previous slide where the CA goes down, that was probably the biggest issue out of the three that we've talked about. And what that led to was actually something called soft fail revocation checking. So this is what it looks like now today when we do something called soft fail. And what soft fail means is the browser will try its best to do the revocation check. So it will get the certificate, it will reach out to most likely the OCSP responder, because we don't really do CRL now. It will reach out to the OCSP responder and it will try and ask the question. But to protect us from the CA being offline, if we don't get an answer back, the browser will just say, well, forget it. I tried, I asked the question, but it looked like there was nobody there, so we'll carry on. I'll accept the certificate and I'll forget about the OCSP. And the only problem with that now is that if the attacker does this, if the attacker blocks that connection, it makes it look like the OCSP responder is down. It makes it look like it's offline. And what happens is that the browser thinks, oh, well, the OCSP responder's down. I'll accept this certificate and we'll carry on. We'll check it next time. And the problem is soft fail is completely pointless because the attacker can block this check and make it look like the CA is offline, and the browser will continue to use the revoked certificate. And this is how it stands basically right now today. This is pretty much what happens across the board in all mainstream browsers. We have soft fail revocation checking. So that revocation check essentially never happens. It never takes place. And if it does, it's soft fail, which is largely pointless. So we have a bit of a problem because essentially what revocation checking looks like now, especially in mainstream browsers, is this. Chromium right now, today, doesn't even try to check the revocation status of a certificate. It doesn't look to the CRL and it doesn't send an OCSP request. It doesn't even bother doing it because of all of the issues largely that I've just talked about. The soft fail checks are pointless. OCSP would be a leak of the user's privacy. So the browsers don't make these checks anymore. So if that certificate gets revoked, then the browser doesn't check it. It just accepts the risk and says, well, it might be revoked, but we're going to carry on using it anyway. So largely where we are today is that revocation is broken. It is essentially completely broken. Soft fail checking is no good because the one time when we need revocation to work, an attacker simply has to block that connection, and then the browser gives up and says, oh, well, I tried, let's carry on. So revocation is broken. This is not this is not a catchy headline or a catchy title to the talk. It really is, the current status on the web. This is where we are today. This is how it is. So we need to look to the future for different ways that we can try and fix this. What can we do about revocation? And there are a couple of things on the horizon that may be able to help us with this. So the first thing, when the browsers kind of stop doing revocation checking, Firefox still does this at present, but I believe it's about September this year roughly when they will also stop doing this. But what they've done is Firefox and Chrome both have a proprietary mechanism built into each of them. Chrome call theirs CRL sets and Firefox call theirs 1CRL. And what the browser vendors do is they reach out to all of the CRL servers of all the different CAs and they download a copy of their CRL, and then they merge them into a giant big file. This is why it's Firefox call theirs 1CRL, because they merge all of the CRLs into one big file. Now, unfortunately, the vast majority of certificates don't make it in. The vendors want these files to be very small, and they only include high-value certificates, and this is largely just CA certificates. Maybe a Facebook or a PayPal or a Twitter certificate would get in there, but certainly I will never get in there, and nobody on this webinar will probably ever get their certificate in there either. These lists are tiny, and you can actually go and download Firefoxes and actually have a look through it. So if the internet was to set on fire and something terrible happened, we do have these proprietary mechanisms built into the browser, but they're never going to help the average citizen. They're never going to help me, and they're never going to help you, unfortunately. But they're good to have. They are at least something. The next thing that we have, and this is more a performance optimization, I guess, is something called OCSP stapling. So I talked about OCSP and this problem where the browser will reach out to the OCSP server and it will request the OCSP response. That comes with a performance overhead because the browser has to do this extra thing, and also the privacy leak that I talked about, because you're advertising which websites you're going to that OCSP responder. So what we do with OCSP stapling instead is the browser doesn't make the OCSP request. We, as the website, make the OCSP request, and we fetch the OCSP response. And the reason we call it stapling is the idea is we've got these two documents, we've got the certificate and the OCSP response, and we staple them together and give them both to the client at the same time. So when we give the client our certificate, we also give it the OCSP response, and we say, look, we've already been to the OCSP responder and fetched this for you. Here it is stapled to the certificate. Now, at first glance, OCSP stapling sounds quite odd. But the OCSP response is signed by the certificate authority, just like our certificate is signed. So just like the browser can validate the certificate, the browser can also validate the OCSP response. So we have the same level of assurance. This sounds a bit odd, but it is perfectly safe and secure. So we fixed the performance issue on the client, and we've also fixed that privacy leak where the browser was asking the OCSP responder. And the good thing for us is that we can fetch one OCSP response and store it for maybe a day and use the same one to all of our visitors. So it's better for everybody. Everybody should support OCSP stapling on their websites. But the problem is OCSP stapling isn't mandatory. And we certainly can't rely on an attacker to do this. So if an attacker has a certificate and they fetch the OCSP response, which says the certificate is revoked, is the attacker going to give that to the browser? And the answer is no, they're not. It's a great performance optimization, but right now we can't depend on it for security. The next mechanism kind of fixes that problem, and it does essentially exactly what it says. It's something called OCSP must staple, and this fixes the optional nature of OCSP stapling. Now, if we want to use must staple, when we first go to the certificate authority and ask them for a certificate, like we talked about earlier, we have to ask them to set a special flag inside our certificate called the must staple flag. And essentially what this says is, if you ever receive this certificate, then this certificate must be served with an OCSP staple. You can't serve just this certificate on its own. It has to be served with the OCSP response stapled to that. And we just use our certificate as normal. It doesn't really change anything apart from the fact that we now have to staple. We have to enable OCSP stapling. So we're forcing that requirement upon ourselves, but we also force that requirement upon anybody that may steal our key and try to use our certificate. It doesn't really change much. It's literally just an extra piece of text. So if we go back to what we were looking at the contents of the certificate earlier, the technical name for this is an X.509v3 extension. It's not really very interesting. We just call it must staple. So you set this flag in the certificate, and the CA will just add this extra bit of text into your certificate. And it's the browser that will enforce this. The browser will see this certificate, it will see that it has must staple set, and it will only accept it if that OCSP staple is present. And this is what this looks like. So this is the standard scenario. We have our browser, it's gone to the website, it's got the certificate, and it's got the OCSP response stapled with it. If we now switch this out to the attacker, so in an attack scenario, in a compromise scenario, the attacker reaches out to the OCSP responder, and the OCSP response says the certificate is revoked. So that's no good because the attacker doesn't want to serve that. It says the cert is revoked. It means the attack is not going to succeed. But the only problem is if the attacker doesn't staple, because we now have the must staple flag set, if the attacker doesn't staple an OCSP response, the browser will reject the certificate and say, well, this is a must staple certificate. It has to have that OCSP staple with it. So we now have, using must staple, we can actually make sure that revocation checking happens. We can fix this current scenario where revocation checking is broken. Now, must staple is brand new. It's a brand new mechanism. It's currently only supported by Firefox, but support will come in time. Everything is new at some point, and very soon it will be universally supported. But this will be the first time for a very long time, actually, that you can reliably revoke a certificate and say, okay, we've lost this document, we've revoked it, so we know that nobody can abuse it. Because right now you can't say that. It's a bit of a gamble. But there are other ways that we can make the ecosystem better, and that we do need to make the ecosystem better because we need more transparency. And if you get a certificate on your server and you're compromised and you lose that certificate, you know about the certificate's existence. You know that you had it and that you lost it, and therefore you can take action. But what if I manage to obtain one as a hacker and you don't know about it? What if I manage to, maybe I compromise a CA, maybe, it's a backhand deal and I bribe somebody. But there is the perfectly, kind of possible scenario where I can somehow get a certificate for your domain name. And if I don't tell you that I have that, how do you know that it exists? You don't know that it exists. And what that means is you can never request for it to be revoked and say, hey, this isn't my certificate, we need to revoke that. So as long as I don't tell you I have the certificate, I can use it for as long as I want. So we need more transparency. As a website operator, if somebody somewhere has a certificate for your website, you need to be able to know about that. And we are fixing this. We are introducing something called certificate transparency. And CT is a really simple mechanism. And in the most part, it introduces an extra burden onto the CA, not onto us, because the CA has to maintain their CRL and OCSP infrastructure, and they also have to log certificates into something called a CT log, a certificate transparency log. Now, when the CA does this, these CT logs are completely open and public, and all of you can actually go to a website right now and just have a look through these logs. And the idea is that hopefully one day you will, and you will go to these logs and say, right, what certificates exist for my domain name? What is out there? And the CA is required to log the issuance of a certificate into this CT log. So the point here is that if somebody somehow manages to issue a certificate for your domain, you will know about it by monitoring the CT logs for domains that you own. But we can't just rely on this and hope that they do it. We need some kind of technical mechanism to help us ensure that a certificate is logged into CT, because we can't take everybody's word for it. We need a reliable way of checking. So the main idea will be that the CA logs the certificate into CT. And when you log a certificate into CT, you get something back to prove that you logged it. And it's called an SCT. It's a signed certificate timestamp. This is your proof that you definitely put this certificate into this CT log at this time. And you can then use that and say, look, I have proof that it has been logged. Here it is. Here is my SCT. But it's not just the CAs that can log to CT. You as a website operator can also do this right now if you wish, or you as a person. You can take a certificate and go log it into a log. There is no requirement. These logs are completely open and public, and anybody can submit a valid certificate to one of these logs. So we need a way to prove that we've done this. The SCT is that proof, but how do we advertise that? How do we get this to the browser? And there are three different mechanisms. You probably only really need to pay attention to the first one here, because this is the one that I think 99.9% of websites are going to use, because it doesn't require anybody to do anything. Everything will magically work if we use a certificate extension. So what happens for us to get our SCTs, our inclusion proofs, is we issue our CSR to get our certificate as normal. So we want to set up HTTPS. We issue this CSR to Let's Encrypt. And what Let's Encrypt will do is they will actually log, it's something called the pre-certificate, which is basically the certificate before it's been signed and issued, because they haven't issued it at this point. And the CT requirements are that you log it into at least 3 different logs, largely for availability and redundancy purposes. And one of them has to be operated by Google, and one of them has to not be operated by Google. Those are the requirements. So Let's Encrypt will choose which ones they want to log to, and they will submit what we call the pre-certificate. And of course, they've submitted to the log, so they will get their SCTs back. And what they actually do is they embed those inside the certificate that they give to us. So we get our certificate back just like usual. And as far as we're concerned, if you don't want to know, then you can just treat this like any other certificate, because it is just like any other certificate. And we then install that certificate on our web server and serve it to the browser. So the browser now has the SCTs. And what that means is the browser knows that this certificate was definitely logged into at least those 3 logs that are represented by the SCTs. So the browser knows this is a public certificate. It has been announced. This certificate wasn't issued as part of a hack or a compromise or some backroom deal that nobody knows about. So if the site operator wanted to know about this certificate, they could do, because they can see it in the CT log. So we now have full transparency. There's no way for me as the hacker to get a certificate and for you not to know about it, because as soon as I get the certificate, the CA will log it to CT, and you as the operator of the site will be able to see that. If I don't log it to CT, or the CA doesn't log it to CT for whatever reason, then the browser won't accept it because it doesn't have the SCTs. So the delivery of the SCTs is the requirement here. And that's what proves to the browser, look, this is definitely a legitimate certificate. It's not hidden. It's not secret. It's not, it's not anything that we need to be worried about, because look, it's been logged in these public log files. So everybody knows about its existence. So that's the way that I see most websites kind of operating with CT, because this doesn't require the website operator to do anything. There's no change in the process for us. We apply for the certificate, we get the certificate, and then we deliver the certificate to the browser. And these SCTs, I mean, most of your websites probably already support this, and perhaps you just don't know. The deadline isn't coming until April next year where this is required, but most certificate authorities are already kind of warming up their processes. They're starting to do this now ahead of the requirement. But there are 2 other ways. I think for most sites, they won't know that this is coming, but I'm not really sure I agree with a website having this new feature turned on and the website not knowing anything about it. So if you want to take a little bit more control, or you want to actually kind of control your own destiny, then you can deliver the SCTs with one of these other 2 mechanisms if you wish to do so. And the first of these is what we call a TLS feature extension. But as I explain it, it's essentially like something we've already talked about. So what we do is we get our certificate as normal. So we go to the CA, we fetch our certificate. And then what we do, instead of depending on the CA to do this, we as the website operator, we log that certificate into the CT log. So we get our certificate, we go to the logs and say, I would like to place this into the log, and we get back our SCTs for that as usual. And then the way that we get those to the browser, because it's the browser that wants these SCTs, is essentially, this is very similar to OCSP stapling. When we would normally deliver the OCSP staple, we can also deliver other documents that the browser may be interested in or may require. So it's called a TLS feature extension. We just send the SCTs along with the certificate and say, here's our certificate. And by the way, here's these other 3 documents that you will also need. But the good thing with this approach is it does introduce a technical burden on the site, yes, but it allows us to have a bit more control over the process. Maybe even do this as a backup to the ones already embedded in the certificate. But it allows you to choose the logs that you use, how you deliver the SCTs. And there is a third mechanism here. I don't think that many sites will use this, but for full coverage, I'll talk about it. And it is actually with OCSP stapling. So I just talked about OCSP stapling and why everybody should use this. And you can actually use OCSP stapling to deliver your SCTs as well. So as normal, we apply for our certificate. And the CA as a separate process will log those to CT as usual and fetch the SCTs. But instead of putting the SCTs into your certificate, what they will do is they will actually load the SCTs onto their OCSP responder. And that way, when we reach out to get the OCSP response, then the OCSP response contains the SCTs, and then we just OCSP staple as usual. And again, this will kind of just magically work, because as long as we have OCSP stapling enabled, the SCTs will be inside that OCSP response and the browser will get them. It doesn't care how it gets them, as long as it gets them and as long as they're valid. So that's the third mechanism. I think that most people will go for the certificate extension one, largely because they don't know it's happening and it will just happen automatically for them. But there are these other 2. If you want to be more in control or have some more assertion of this process, there are these other ways that you can deliver the SCTs as well. So this fixes the transparency issue. This allows us to have kind of that assurance that if somebody somewhere gets a certificate for our website, then we will know about it. No matter who it is or where it is, we will know about it. And if we don't know about it, then the browser won't accept it anyway, so we don't need to worry. So no matter which way it happens, certificate transparency will fix the current transparency problem in the ecosystem. But looking at that, we want to know if some other CA issues a certificate for us. And we have no way of saying to them, well, we don't want you to do that. Like, why can one of the 300 or 400 or more CAs on the planet, why can they issue for your domain? And why can't you tell them, I don't want you to. I only want to use Let's Encrypt, or I only want to use Komodo or whoever. So we're also introducing something to fix that. We need a way to authorize specific certificate authorities to issue. We need a way to say, look, I'm only going to use these 2 organizations, so nobody else should issue for me, because these are the only 2 that I'm going to use, and these are the only 2 that I authorize. And we're introducing something to do that called CAA. And this is the problem, right? It's like, these are all the CAs in the planet. They're just nameless organizations. They pop up all over the place, and they can all issue certificates for you. We want to get rid of that. We want to fix that. And the fix is certificate authority authorization. Now, I really like CAA because it's an incredibly simple mechanism. There probably isn't another mechanism that rivals it for simplicity. And it's this. It's just a DNS record. So there's a new DNS resource record called CAA. So just like we have A records or text records, you can now have a CAA record. And what you do is you put the name, the website specifically, of the certificate authority in there that you authorize to issue certificates for your domain. So if I set this on my website, I'm saying, I'm scotthelme.co.uk, this is my CAA record, and I am only authorizing Let's Encrypt to issue certificates for me. Nobody else is authorized to issue certificates for my domain. And what happens now is that the CAs have to check this record from the 7th of September this year, if I remember correctly. They will be required to check this record. Right now it's currently optional. But they will check this record and they will say, oh, I am authorized to do this, that's fine, I can issue it. Or they will look at this and say, actually, I'm not authorized to issue certificates for this website, so I'm going to stop. I'm not going to issue this certificate. And if you use more than one CA, many organizations have 1 or 2 or 3 partners, different organizations that they use. You can just create multiple records and whitelist the CAs that you authorize. And it really is that simple. It's just a DNS record that you set, but it allows you to assert that control. It allows you to say, I only authorize these particular CAs and nobody else should be issuing certificates for my domain. And previously you couldn't do that. Any CA on the planet could issue, and you had no way to assert that level of authority, but we do now with CAA. So those are kind of like the basic steps, and CAA is great because this is how it fits into the kind of the life cycle, is that when we send that CSR, the CA has to do a lookup in DNS to check if they're authorized, and if they are authorized, then they will issue the certificate as normal, and we can carry on happy using that. But it does depend on the CA to do the check, so we are relying on them to do the right thing. So CAA doesn't protect us from all bad scenarios, but it does protect us from a lot of them as well. So it's not a fix-all solution, which is one of the common criticisms I see of CAA. But even if we're an organization, and let's say we have a contract to only get certificates from one particular CA, we can enforce that with CAA as well. So we can even use it to enforce our own internal policy. Because if somebody tries to go to somebody who isn't your approved vendor, then that vendor will not be able to issue the certificate because CAA prohibits them as well. So there are lots of nice things about CAA. Of course, it's not the perfect solution, but it's one of the many solutions I've just talked about, where we're taking steps towards a better ecosystem, to a better situation from where we are now. And hopefully the importance of revocation is apparent. We create these documents, these powerful documents that prove our identity. And right now, if you lose one, there's a very good chance that you couldn't do anything about that. And these documents can be valid for years. Imagine if you lost your passport and somebody could use it. There was a way for them to use it and you couldn't take that back. They're powerful documents, and we need a way to handle them better. So the question that I want to leave you with is this. if you go out and you use certificates already and you're about to use certificates, you're about to start using HTTPS, when you acquire these documents, these certificates, could you revoke one? Can you revoke a certificate if you were to be compromised and lose one today, right now? And hopefully that's me done. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful. I would love to take some Q&A now. I think hopefully the host is still on the line to do that. I'm going to open up my Q&A window now, and we will see if any have already come through. Yeah. One question has come through here, and it's regarding certificate transparency logs, CT logs, and it says, what prevents an attacker who stole my private key from trying to use it? So I guess CT is fixing a slightly different part of the problem here. If your key is compromised and stolen, then somebody is trying to use the certificate that they stole from your server. What CT fixes is if somebody goes and gets a certificate from elsewhere without your knowledge. So there are two different problems. One is if you have a certificate and it's stolen, and the other one is if somebody manages to obtain a certificate without you knowing about it. CT fixes that second one. So by forcing these CT logs to be public and for all certificates to be logged to them, it means that somebody can't go to a different CA somewhere and get a certificate issued without your knowledge. So it fixes the transparency issue, not the key compromise issue. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, please do feel free to repost a follow-on. So yeah, so the private key compromise, right now, I guess there's no actual full solution. The must-staple certificates are realistically the only way to fix this. So if you have a must-staple certificate and somebody compromises your private key, once you revoke it, then the certificate is revoked. And because of the must-staple flag, you can ensure that a revocation check happens. So must-staple is only supported in Firefox right now. Hopefully, in the coming months, we will see more widespread support, but it is a very new mechanism. So obviously, we do have to wait a little while for that. But to fix private key compromise, you have to have been using a must-staple certificate in the first instance. But there are some considerations in deploying those. Most CAs support this. Most CAs will allow you to set it. And actually, just recently, a CDN company called Cloudflare wrote a really good blog about their implementation of OCSP stapling. So that would make some great follow-up reading as well. There is another one here. What about mass attackers? Are they more powerful to broker protection and pass certificate? So I'm just looking at a question here in the chat. I just want to make sure that I address this one correctly. Which protection specifically does that question refer to? If you could just follow up that with just to make sure I answer the right question, that's all. I just need a bit more specifics.
Oh,
no, maybe it's not coming.
Yeah, seems like everyone is happy with your answer. Well, in more questions and answers, guys. Don't be shy. Okay. Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks a lot to you again. It was a cool lecture. It was interesting indeed, and I would like to remind our attendees that whenever you have, after the lecture, some more questions appear in your head, please don't hesitate to contact Scott. He'll be happy to answer questions, and if you'd like to know latest news and events, please follow our pages on LinkedIn and Facebook. And now it's time to, we do hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we will appreciate if you answer a short questionnaire. You can see it on your screens right now. It will take you just a few moments of your life to do that, but that will make us so happy. Okay. Thanks a lot, and see you next time on our webinars.
Thank you. Bye-bye.